In the desolate, snowy mountains, the lone cowboy, Caleb, discovered a woman tied with barbed wire. At her feet were 3 newborn babies, trembling on the brink of death. "You're coming with me," the lone frontiersman said to the woman who had been beaten for bearing 3 daughters in Wyoming Territory in late January 1877. The high, snow-covered peaks of the Snowhorn Mountains were buried in ice and snow. The wind howled like the cry of a dying, wounded beast. Yet, the first sound that reached Caleb Thorne's ears wasn't the wind. It was a faint, fragile, high-pitched cry. He pulled on the reins, and his horse's hooves sank into the snow with a crunching sound before stopping. Caleb tilted his head toward the woods. There was another sound, a baby's cry. No, more than one. He squinted, cautiously dismounting. The trail ahead, long untouched by human footsteps, cut through the forest like an old scar. Each of his steps sank deep, up to his ankles. Caleb led his horse, his ears still listening, his breath forming white clouds in the frigid air. The cries grew clearer as he approached a clearing where an old wooden post stood, half rotted and half buried in the snow. And then he saw her, a woman who could barely stand, cruelly tied to the post with sharp barbed wire. Her hands were twisted behind her back, her flesh torn, and her wrists bleeding. Snow clung to her eyelashes, and her hair had frozen into solid clumps. Her lips were chapped, her face ashen as a corpse, with only mottled bruises streaking across her cheeks. At her feet were 3 small bundles, 3 newborn babies, likely less than a day old. One whimpered, the other 2 were silent. They were only wrapped in tattered pieces of fabric from their mother's nightgown. Her head stirred slightly. She was still conscious but barely clinging to life. "Don't let them take my daughters away." Her voice was as weak as a whisper on the wind. Caleb knelt beside her without a moment's hesitation. He took off his gloves and carefully touched each baby. Their breaths were weak, but steady. Their skin was freezing, a cold that cut to the bone. "You're coming with me." His voice was low, firm, and resolute. The woman slowly blinked, as if she had to struggle to understand his words. Caleb drew the knife from his boot and cut each strand of barbed wire. The blade scraped against the rusty steel, which had already eaten deep into the flesh of her arms. Blood gushed as she was freed, but she didn't cry out or tremble. He wrapped his arm around her waist as her exhausted legs gave out. Her body slumped, heavy from blood loss and exhaustion. Caleb immediately lifted her, pressing her close to his chest. Then, he went back for the babies, holding the smallest one inside his coat, carefully wrapping them tightly in the thick wool blanket from his saddle. All 3 were nearly motionless. The wind howled, cutting across the open space. Caleb used his body to shield them, shielding all he could. His horse neighed anxiously nearby. He glanced toward the horizon. They had half a mile of snowy slope to go to get back to his cabin. Through the blizzard, he adjusted his hold on Eleanor, tightened the blanket around the newborns, and whispered. He wasn't sure who he was speaking to her, the babies, the bone-chilling wind, or maybe God. "You are not going to die. Not here. Not on my land." He carefully climbed onto his horse, holding her in front of him, the babies tucked securely between them. She was as light as if she had no weight. The newborns were even lighter than winter rabbits. The cold had drained all their strength. Time was no longer on their side. The way back was slow, the wind relentless. But Caleb moved without stopping. He didn't have time to ask her who she was or what demon was chasing her. He only had time to keep her alive. His cabin was dark when they arrived. The fire had long since gone out. Caleb kicked the door open, carried her straight inside, and gently laid her on the bed made of thick quilts near the fireplace. Next were the babies. He placed them in a basket lined with rabbit fur, then turned back to build a fire with hands that didn't tremble. Not yet. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing the tracks that led to where she had suffered. Inside, Caleb worked silently by the flickering firelight. A stranger had been left for dead. But not here. Not on his land. The cabin was nothing more than 4 walls and a sloped roof, groaning under the weight of the snow, but at least it was dry. The fire that Caleb Thorne had built was now crackling with life. The warmth spread from the hearth, pushing back the cold that clung to the corners of the room like a second skin. Caleb moved with a practiced silence. He hung his soaking wet coat next to the fire, taking off his gloves to reveal his calloused and cracked hands. Eleanor remained unconscious on the bed made of wool blankets in the corner of the room. Her lips were purple, and her hands were loosely wrapped in linen strips. She hadn't stirred since they arrived. The children had begun to whimper, their cries weak but full of life. Caleb took a flask hidden behind a pile of firewood, filled an iron pot with goat's milk, and placed it over the fire. He found a small spoon carved from pine and set it next to a tin bowl. Then he went to the woman. She was barely breathing. He dipped a cloth into a basin of warm water, wrung it out, and began to wipe away the dried blood on her ankles and calves. The bruises were deep, with swollen patches of black and purple along her shins. Someone had kicked her hard, many times. Her knees were also scraped raw and bleeding. He worked so gently, as if afraid to hurt her. He dipped the cloth in warm water, wrung it out, and carefully wiped the dirt and dried blood from her feet. Then, he pulled the edge of the blanket up, tucking her in thoughtfully. She remained unconscious, not stirring at all. Her breathing was very shallow, but steady, a small sign that life was still there. When the milk was warm, he ladled some into the tin bowl and tested it on the back of his hand. It was still too hot. He waited, watching the smallest baby. It had begun to cry for real now. With weak and urgent sobs, Caleb knelt beside the makeshift cradle and reached inside. The newborn's skin had warmed up again. It was a good sign. Caleb used the spoon to give small sips to the little girl. She took it clumsily, then greedily. He did the same for the other two, stopping only to wipe their mouths and wrap the blankets more tightly around their heads. A faint sound from the bed drew his attention. The woman stirred, her eyelids fluttering like leaves in the wind. Her voice was hoarse, almost inaudible. "My name is Eleanor. Eleanor Roosevelt." Caleb took 2 heavy steps to her side and knelt down. "Caleb," he said simply, but with a solid certainty. Her lips moved again, but no sound came out. Her eyes left his, looking toward the children sleeping peacefully in the flickering firelight. One of them sneezed, the smallest one. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry, didn't truly sob. A single, silent tear rolled down her chapped cheeks. Her body was too exhausted, too broken, to muster the strength to sob. Caleb stood up and went to the back of the room. From an old chest, he pulled out a thick moose-hide robe, lined with rabbit fur. He folded it, brought it to the basket, and carefully placed it under the sleeping children. The temporary cradle was now warmer and softer. When he looked back, Eleanor was watching. He said nothing, just gave her a slow nod and returned to the fireplace to add more wood. Sparks shot up like tiny fireflies, then vanished into the smoky rafters of the cabin. Time passed in silence. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire, the wind outside, and the breathing of 4 people who were slowly returning from the brink of death. A moment later, as Caleb added wood to the fire for the last time before resting, he heard her voice again. This time, it was more resolute. "You didn't abandon us." He didn't answer. He just sat by the fire, staring into it. The snow still howled outside, but the cold had been held at bay, at least for now. The storm outside had subsided, leaving a heavy silence that draped the cabin like a shroud. Snow was still falling, but the wind had stopped howling. Inside, the fire burned low, casting a shimmering yellow light onto the rough-hewn wooden walls. Eleanor was propped up on the blankets. Her face had regained some color, though the bruises were still visible beneath her skin like spreading ink blots. Her voice was hoarse, her throat raw from the bone-chilling cold and from crying, but now she could speak. Caleb sat nearby, sharpening a knife on a whetstone with slow, deliberate strokes. He hadn't asked her anything, who she was, who had done this, or why she had been left to die. He understood that his silence, in its own way, was a kindness. "I married Marcus Thuram when I was 17, Eleanor said unexpectedly. Her voice was small but clear in the silent room. He was 34, rich, powerful. My father said I was too lucky. Caleb didn't look up. He continued to hone his knife slowly and steadily. At first I thought I was lucky too, she continued. He took me to a grand house with tall windows and marble floors. I wore silk, slept on feather pillows, but he never touched me like a husband should. Not kindly, not gently. She paused, glancing at the children sleeping soundly by the fireplace. Their small chests rose and fell with a steady rhythm. When the first daughter was born, he scowled. The second, he stopped speaking to me. The third, her voice broke. Finally, Caleb looked up, his eyes calm, steady, and waiting. When the third daughter was born, he called the midwife a witch, said she had cursed my womb. He told his brothers I was nothing more than a mule, useless for not bearing him a son. That night, they beat me. She turned her face slightly, revealing a faded scar along her jawline. An old scar, long faded. I thought he was going to kill me, but instead, he dragged me to the old fence post and tied me there. If the snow doesn't take you, you were meant to live. She recounted his words, her voice bitter. He called it justice. Her hands trembled as she spoke, one instinctively reaching toward the basket holding her daughters. They said girls were nothing but mouths to feed, she whispered. Caleb set the knife down. He didn't speak, not immediately. His jaw tightened once, then he stood, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor as he strode to her side. He knelt down by her bed and took her hand. It was swollen and bruised, the knuckles scabbed over, but he held it as if it were made of glass. He gently cradled it in his large, calloused palm and looked her directly in the eye. His voice was low and sure. Here, he said, your daughters are the only souls worth feeding. Eleanor's eyes welled with tears. This time, she didn't hold them back. She let the tears flow silently down her cheeks, mingling with the warmth of the firelight and the breathing of her daughters. Caleb remained kneeling by her side, his hand holding hers. His presence was silent and solid. Outside, the snow continued to fall. But inside that small cabin, something had changed. Not warmth, but something deeper, something that looked like the beginning of a promise. The snow had begun to melt around the edges of the cabin, turning the white drifts into a gray, slushy mud that revealed patches of frozen ground underneath. The mountains were waking up from their long sleep, but with the spring came more than just the thaw. It also brought news from the lowlands. A knock came just after dawn. Caleb opened the door to a woman wrapped in a green wool shawl. Her breath plumed in the morning air. Her cheeks were flushed from the ride up the mountain. Her horse was tied to a nearby pine, still heaving from the exertion. "Morning, Caleb," she said, her voice clipped and urgent. "Martha," he greeted, stepping aside. "Come in." Eleanor was sitting near the fireplace, one of the babies nestled in her arms. The woman gave her a quick glance, then turned back to Caleb as he closed the door. "It's about her," Martha said. Down below, Marcus Thuram is spreading a story. Caleb didn't move. He's telling everyone she ran off in a fit of lunacy, that she's unstable, that the children belong to him and she's keeping them in secret, unlawfully. Eleanor's eyes widened, her fingers tightening around the newborn in her arms. "He's hired men," Martha continued. "4 of them. They say they're just looking to bring a mother back to where she belongs. But the way they ride, that ain't a rescue party." Caleb nodded. "Just that." Martha looked between the two of them. "I rode up as soon as I heard. They'll find this place. And when they do, they won't be taking her," Caleb said. Eleanor looked at him, something unreadable passing through her eyes. Martha hesitated, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Dried lentils, some jerky, a flask of whiskey. "You'll need it." He took it with a silent nod. Martha left not long after. The rest of the day passed in motion. Caleb resecured the back window latch, reinforced the door with a second crossbar. He stacked firewood near the hearth so Eleanor wouldn't have to go outside. He moved their reserves to the root cellar in case they needed to hide or make a run for it. He didn't say much. He honed his hunting knife until its blade gleamed like silver. Then he slid it into a sheath on his belt and kept it there. As night fell, they slept in fits and starts. The next morning, the air changed. It was too quiet. Even the birds had gone silent. Then came the sound of hooves, 4 of them. Eleanor clutched her daughters closer. Caleb opened the door and stepped outside. 4 horsemen approached slowly, their faces half hidden by wide-brimmed hats. They reined in a few feet from the steps. The lead man had a scar running down one side of his cheek and a pistol on his hip. "Caleb Thorne," he called out. "We're here on a claim." "No," Caleb said. "The woman inside is the wife of Marcus Thuram. She's his property. We have every right to take her and those girls back." Caleb stood his ground, his hands loose at his sides, unarmed. He didn't flinch. His voice was calm, clear. "She was never his, and she's surely not yours." The man's lips curled into a sneer. "You think this is over, old man?" Caleb didn't blink. "You want to try? You come back and try." The 4 riders stared at him in silence for a moment too long. Then the leader jerked his reins. "Let's go," he snapped. "It ain't worth it today." They rode off without another word, snow spraying behind them, but their eyes held a promise of return. Caleb stood on the threshold long after they disappeared. Inside, Eleanor let out a slow breath, still clutching her daughters. Her heart hammered against her ribs. They were safe for now. Yet she knew the danger from the lowlands had not let them go. It was still reaching for this mountain. Spring slowly stretched over the mountainside, softening the thick snow and calling green shoots from bare branches. The days grew longer, and the cabin, once a shelter against a deadly cold, now carried the sense of something almost like a home. Eleanor's steps had grown steady. She no longer stumbled or started at the howl of the wind or the crackle of wood in the hearth. She began to cook simple meals over the fire, using only what Caleb brought back from the woods: pine roots, wild onions, mushrooms, rabbits, wild turkey, or grouse. The meals were not fancy, but they were enough to nourish the life that was slowly returning. The 3 children, Eloise, Ruth, and June, grew noticeably. Their cheeks were plump, their cries louder and sweeter, like young birds finding their voices. They slept in a row in soft nests of coyote skins and straw, lined with pieces of old blankets that Caleb had never had a use for until now. Mornings were the quietest time. Eleanor would be awake before the sun, tending the fire, checking on the children. Caleb would already be gone, off hunting or checking traps. He never left a note, but he always returned. Their conversations remained sparse, not from coldness, but just from lightness, like 2 people learning the language of each other's silence. He never asked about the past. She never spoke of it. The words were buried like skeletons under the frost. Both understood that you couldn't fix what had happened, only survive with what remained. Yet, small comforts had begun to take root. One afternoon, Eleanor saw Caleb at his workbench outside the cabin. He had his coat off, the sleeves of his flannel shirt rolled up, exposing his weathered forearms. He held a carving knife and a thin slab of cedar. She watched him in silence as he worked, whittling away at the wood with a quiet precision. He didn't look up, but he knew she was there. That night, she saw what he had made. 3 wooden plaques, each no longer than a hand, hung above where the baby slept. They bore 3 names carved neatly: Eloise, Ruth, June. Each letter had been carefully sanded smooth, the wood oiled so it caught the firelight. Eleanor brought a hand to her mouth to stifle a cry. No one, not even her own kin, had ever carved her daughters' names onto anything permanent. Now they hung over their heads like prayers. The days turned to gold and green. Eleanor began to sing to the children in the evenings, soft lullabies she remembered from her childhood, songs her own mother used to hum as she braided her hair. Caleb would sit by the door. His large frame leaned against the frame, sharpening a tool or cleaning his rifle, always listening. One evening, the wind shifted. Rain was coming. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Eleanor was stirring a pot of stew over the fire, humming softly. Caleb sat nearby, cleaning a pair of rabbit skins. Without turning, without a hint of awkwardness, she said his name, but his full name, Caleb Thorne. The room grew abruptly silent. His hands stilled. He slowly turned, his eyes catching the firelight and holding it like embers waiting for a breath. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, truly looked as if hearing his name on her lips had changed something deep within him. Eleanor turned, meeting his gaze with a steadiness she hadn't possessed before. "I never said thank you," she whispered. "Not properly." Caleb rose, as silent as ever, and moved closer, but did not touch her. He looked down at the simmering stew, then at the sleeping children behind her, and finally back at her eyes. "You don't have to," he said. A long silence settled between them. Not one of awkwardness or uncertainty, but one of completeness. A completeness of things that didn't need to be said but were now there, in the air, in the fire, in the way they existed next to each other. She smiled, the smallest of curves on her lips. Not a smile that meant everything was settled, but one that meant something had begun. And Caleb Thorne, the man who hadn't spoken 10 sentences a day since she met him, simply gave a single nod and returned to his seat. Outside, the wind picked up. The rain hadn't begun, but it would. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low and steady, and the quiet had never felt so peaceful. The storm hit just after dusk, low and fast over the mountain, turning the wind vicious and the sky a white fury. Snow whipped against the cabin, thick enough to erase tracks in minutes, violent enough to lose a man a few feet from his own door. Inside, the fire crackled and hissed. The windows rattled in their frames. Caleb stood by the back wall, giving the shutters a final check, while Eleanor clutched Ruth and June close, her body curled around them. Eloise slept soundly next to the hearth, unaware of the mounting tension in the room. "Someone's here," Caleb said abruptly. He went to the window, wiped a layer of frost from the pane with the back of his hand, and looked out into the swirling blizzard. Figures, 3 of them, horsemen moving through the storm, cloaks pulled tight, heads down against the wind. They moved slowly, deliberately, pushing back against the mountain's resistance as if they owned it. Caleb stepped back from the window. "It's them," he said. Eleanor's breath hitched. She didn't need to ask who. A single look at Caleb's face told her Marcus had found them. He turned to her, his voice low and urgent. "Take the children. Follow the creek bed. Stay low. Don't stop. Don't come back unless you're with a marshal." Her eyes went wide, but before she could protest, he was already moving. He went to the corner of the room, pulled out the old moose-hide robe, draped it over her shoulders, and stuffed a pouch of jerky dried apples and a small flask into her pocket. Then he pulled out a small knife, no longer than her hand, and pressed it into her palm. "Keep this on you. If they catch up, don't hesitate." She stared at him, her lips trembling. "What about you? I'll lead them another way." He kissed Eloise's head once, quick and silent, then turned back to her. "Go now." Eleanor bundled the children, 2 in her arms, 1 on her back, and slipped out the back door, disappearing into the trees. Caleb watched the door close behind her. Then he got to work. He pulled a spare coat onto a broom and tied it to a fence post near the south path. He lit an oil lantern and hid it behind a log to cast a shadow. Then he led his horse halfway down and tied its reins to a tree, as if it had been left in a hurry. He even lit a small fire just around the bend of the trail, enough smoke to draw attention, enough heat to cause confusion. Then he returned to the cabin and waited. The knock came a few minutes later, hard and unwelcome. Caleb opened the door to 3 men, covered in snow and grim-faced. The one in front was Marcus Thuram. He hadn't changed much, still with that same cold, polished handsomeness, but his eyes were colder than the storm behind him. "Flint," he said, his voice cutting through the wind. "She took what's mine. The girls carry my name." Caleb stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. "Did you come all this way for a lie?" "I came here for blood. I came here because you left her to die. She belongs to me," Marcus growled, pulling a pistol from his belt. Caleb didn't move. "She belongs to herself." Marcus's jaw twitched. Last chance. Caleb stood tall, unarmed, and unwavering. "You'll have to shoot me." One of the men behind Marcus stepped forward, swinging the butt of his rifle. The blow caught Caleb on the shoulder. He staggered backward, hitting the door frame and collapsing onto one knee. Snow soaked through his shirt, and a dark red bloomed at the seam. Marcus stepped forward, his gun leveled, and then dropped the gun. A new voice cut through the air, loud and righteous. A lantern swayed from the tree line. Marshal Dawson rode into view, flanked by 2 deputies, rifles raised. Marcus turned just in time to see Eleanor step from the woods behind them, her robe torn, her face streaked with snow and determination. "Tell them what you did," she said, her voice hard, "or I will." Marcus froze. The marshal's horse snorted. "Arrest him," Dawson commanded. Marcus dropped his gun. The deputies dismounted and cuffed all 3 men, leading them away through the snow. Marcus's protests were weak, his voice broken by disbelief. Eleanor rushed to Caleb, who was still slumped on the threshold, blood dripping from his shoulder into the snow. She knelt beside him, her eyes tear-filled, but not panicked. "You are not going to die," she said. "You hear me?" He groaned, his breath a wheeze. "Wasn't planning on it." "Good," she said, putting a hand over the wound, stemming the bleeding, "because I'm not burying the only man who stood between us and hell." Caleb blinked at her. Then, despite the pain, he smiled. "Knew you'd come back." Spring was finding its way back to the valley, with wildflowers pushing through the thawing soil and robins chirping from the pine boughs. The storm had passed, and the worst wounds had begun to heal on the skin, in the memory, and between 2 people who had almost lost everything. Caleb's shoulder mended slowly. Eleanor helped him bandage it each day with calm, steady hands. He never complained, and she never fussed. Life had taken a brutal turn, but they were here, breathing, moving on, building something out of what was left. With the danger gone, they worked on the cabin together. What had been a rickety shelter for survival was now becoming a home. Caleb extended the eastern wall to make room for a bigger hearth. Eleanor painted the faded shutters, a pale green, with leftover paint from an old can that Martha had brought up from town. Before long, they decided to open their doors to travelers. There were always men on the trade road, trappers, lumber haulers, farmhands moving from county to county. Word spread that a hot pot of stew and a safe night's sleep could be found near the mountainside, just past the second bend. They called it the Hearth at Granger's Range. Eleanor cooked meals that warmed the belly and softened the heart. Venison stew, root vegetable hash, sweet cornbread with molasses. Caleb hunted and chopped wood, maintained the horse stalls, and made sure no trouble ever crossed the threshold. The 3 girls grew at a remarkable rate. Eloise walked first. Ruth said the first word, "Fire." June sang before she could speak. Guests came and went, and with each passing day, laughter began to echo more frequently inside the cabin. One evening after the last guest had left and the children were asleep, Eleanor stepped outside to find Caleb on the porch, sanding a rough plank. He looked up at her, reached into a satchel at his feet, and pulled something out. A shawl, thickly woven by hand, dyed a deep maroon with darker threads sewn into it. On one corner, there were 3 letters carefully embroidered, E.R.J., and below them, in a capital script, the word "Worthy." She took it without a word, her fingers tracing the threads, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you make this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded. "For you," he said, "because you are." She swallowed hard, pulling the shawl close to her chest. A long, rich silence settled between them. Then she said, "You chose us when you could have walked away." Caleb didn't answer with words. Instead, he stepped forward, gently took her hand, and looked into her eyes. There was no proposal, no grand declaration, just a promise. That night, with the fire humming and the mountains silent, they exchanged vows, not with gold rings or a gathering of guests, but with soft voices and steady hearts. Caleb gave her a strand of smooth, carved wooden beads tied with braided cord, one for each daughter. He wrapped them around their small wrists while they slept. For Eleanor, he offered nothing but a hand. She took it, and in doing so, she took everything that mattered. There were no flowers, no priest, no music, just 2 people and a fire, and it was enough. Spring had fully claimed the mountain. The snow was gone from the slopes, replaced by soft moss and wild violets that snaked along the stone path leading up to the cabin. The smell of pine mingled with something warmer. Wood smoke, wild herbs, and fresh-baked bread from the hearth. Children's laughter echoed across the yard. Eloise, Ruth, and June chased each other around the porch steps, their dresses smudged with grass and joy. Their hair, warm in the sun and wild, bounced as they ran. Eleanor watched them from the kitchen window, her hands covered in flour, a soft smile on her face. The hearth at Granger's Range had grown into something more than a shelter. It was now a waypoint, a quiet legend among riders and traders. Travelers came up the winding path not just for food, but for the peace, for something that felt like home, even for a single night. They would sit at the rough-hewn table, cups of steaming pine tea in their hands, and listen to the girls' laughter outside. Eleanor would serve them with quiet grace, sometimes tucking a warm roll into their coat pockets for the road ahead. Caleb was mostly in the background, tending the garden plots he'd built with his own hands, planting potatoes, carrots, squash, and beans. When the children took their afternoon naps, Eleanor taught the local children to read from a slate and a piece of charcoal. Some walked 5 miles to her class. Others stayed long after the letters had faded just to hear her sing. Every night, the fire in the hearth was carefully tended, not because they feared the cold, but because they had known it too well to ever forget it. One evening after the last traveler had left, Caleb sat on the porch steps, his boots covered in dirt, a basket of green beans by his side. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the world in warm shades of gold. Eleanor came out with 2 cups in her hands and sat down next to him. The girls were running across the yard, giggling, barefoot, and full of life. Eleanor handed Caleb his cup of tea, then rested her hand on his. Her touch was gentle, familiar, and his fingers curled slightly underneath hers. She watched her daughters run wild in the sunset, then turned to him, her voice soft. "This fire between us, it never went out." Caleb looked ahead, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "It just needed a place to live," he said. They sat like that for a long time, hand in hand, as the sky turned a shade of lavender and the first stars began to flicker in the twilight. No one passing by would know the whole story, not the blood and the storm, the fear and the fight. But they would see the way she smiled, the way he looked at her, the way the 3 little girls danced in a patch of mountain sunlight, and know that something powerful had been built here. Not from wealth, not from war, but from a kind of stubborn, beautiful love that survived even the worst winters and stayed forever. Thank you for joining us on this story of fire, ice, and a love that refused to fade. In a land where justice was scarce, and warmth was even rarer, Caleb and Eleanor proved that sometimes the strongest homes are built not of wood or stone, but of trust, of sacrifice, and of choosing each other when it would have been easier to walk away. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that even in the harshest places, love can take root and grow, subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable journeys into the heart of the American frontier, where bullets can miss but hearts don't. Hit the bell so you never miss a story that might just stay with you forever.